Good afternoon, everyone. This is Misty with Louisiana Department of Education, and today's training is on hurricane preparedness. As we have experienced over the past school years, many unforeseen situations occur in a school food service operation that may compromise food safety and the ability of the child nutrition program to provide safe meals. As we all know, child nutrition programs have been called to serve emergency meals to families over the past years. Documenting procedures is a critical first step in developing a hurricane preparedness plan. It is no question that Louisiana is one of the most vulnerable in the country when it comes to hurricanes. Hurricane Preparedness Week is actually next week, April 30th through May 6, 2023, and the official start of hurricane season is June 1st. As stakeholders in supporting community nutrition outreach, let's get started now to be prepared for a hurricane or weather disaster strike. The effects on food service operations and how to prepare for providing emergency meal services during these threats will be the focus as we work through this presentation. Major threats are typically flooding and wind damage. Making advanced preparation is recommended as crucial supplies can become scarce during a severe weather event. It is essential to train staff annually for power outages, water outages, or boil notices, flood waters, and food safety or hazard plans specific to a hurricane disaster. The Atlantic hurricane season is the period in a year from June through November when hurricanes usually form in the Atlantic Ocean. On a worldwide scale, May is the least active month, while late August through September are the most active. Arm yourself with knowledge of hurricane status definitions and a weather radio to stay alert during hurricane season. A weather radio is a specialized radio receiver that is designed to receive public broadcast service, typically from government-owned radio stations like NOAA, which is dedicated to airing weather reports on a continual basis, with the routine weather reports being interrupted by emergency weather reports whenever needed. Let's go over tropical storm and hurricane watch versus warning. A tropical storm watch means that tropical storm conditions with sustained winds from 39 to 73 miles per hour are possible within the specified area within 48 hours. Hurricane watch was when hurricane conditions with sustained winds of 74 miles per hour or greater are possible within your area. Because it may not be safe to prepare for a hurricane once winds reach tropical storm force, the National Hurricane Center issues hurricane watches 48 hours before it anticipates tropical storm force winds. A tropical storm warning is when tropical storm conditions with sustained winds of 39 to 73 miles per hour are expected within your area within 36 hours. And a hurricane warning is when hurricane conditions with sustained winds of 74 miles per hour or greater are expected somewhere within the specified area. The National Hurricane Center issues a hurricane warning 36 hours in advance of the tropical storm force winds to give you time to complete your preparations. All preparations should be complete. Evacuate immediately if ordered to do so. Remember when making plans for a hurricane that the category of the hurricane will make a difference in the duration of the hurricane and/or emergency situation you may be faced with. Hurricanes are categorized by the National Weather Service based on their intensity by using a scale of 1 to 5. The scale, which is outlined on this slide, categorizes storms according to their sustained winds, the storm surges produced, and the damage expected as a result. LEAs often develop hurricane preparedness plans with a tiered response based on the hurricane scale. This is helpful when training staff on their role during the hurricane and what policies and procedures should be followed based on the scale of the emergency. Natural disasters can occur that affect operations for an hour, such as a temporary electrical outage, or for days, weeks, or even months. In light of the varying degrees a hurricane may affect your C&P operation, it is essential in tailoring hurricane plans specific to your LEA and each facility or school site in terms of providing meals during an emergency. The Institute of Child Nutrition has developed a guide for emergency readiness plan and forms that can be used to help develop a hurricane preparedness plan. We will discuss this in more detail later in the presentation. For the purpose of this training, we will focus primarily on the presidential declared disasters. When the state of Louisiana determines a need for federal disaster assistance, the governor requests assistance from the president. Based on FEMA's evaluation and recommendation, a formal presidential major disaster or emergency declaration is then made. This is when waivers may be requested by the state agency. As an SFA, plan to contact the state agency to request assistance with planning for disaster meal services as soon as a serious hurricane threat to your parish or district approaches to receive guidance. Note that procedures begin when a situation of distress is determined by public officials. An emergency declaration addresses impending emergencies or disasters. It is issued when in the determination of the president, federal assistance is needed to supplement state and local efforts and capabilities to save lives and to protect property and public health and safety, or to lessen or avert the threat of a catastrophic. A major disaster declaration is declared by the president when a major disaster has been assessed that overwhelms the combined capabilities of state and local government resources. Declaration of a major disaster then frees the financial, legal, and other resources USDA requires to grant waivers. Note that in the process involved in a presidential declaration of a disaster requires time and multiple stages of assessment. Only after a major disaster declaration is declared by the president will USDA be able to consider waivers for approval for child nutrition programs. This is why waivers are often published well after a hurricane devastates an area, and is also why communicating emergency situations with the state agency is necessary to receive program guidance in the early stages when disaster strikes. In the aftermath of a disaster, school districts can provide critical nutrition support to students through the school, summer, and after-school nutrition programs. After a major disaster declaration is issued by FEMA, USDA has the authority to waive certain program requirements that limit access to meals in situations resulting from damage or disruptions due to natural or man-made disasters. School districts can work with their state child nutrition agency and USDA to apply for waivers from program requirements that would otherwise limit students' access to meals. Waivers will vary widely based on the extent of the hurricane or disaster. Another way C&P operators may assist families is to encourage the school community to pre-register annually for DSNAP before a disaster strikes. DSNAP provides food assistance to eligible households who do not receive regular SNAP benefits and who need help buying groceries due to lost income or damages following a disaster. As a reminder to SFAs, DSNAP is coordinated by the Department of Children and Family Services. Disaster SNAP is provided in areas designated as part of the Presidential Disaster Declaration. As a best practice, encourage parents to complete DSNAP pre-registration as a part of school orientation or include the link and instructions as part of the beginning of the school year packet typically mailed to families. Reasons families should pre-register include that online pre-registration is simple and can be done online through the CAFE customer portal, and pre-registration will speed up the application process that determines final eligibility after DSNAP is authorized. Remember that in the event of a hurricane or disaster, Student families may not have the computer or Wi-Fi access required to begin pre-registration for DSNAP. For families that are pre-registered, a phone number is available for completing the final application step. DCFS will provide an electronic benefits card to eligible families, which allows them access to purchase much-needed foods during a disaster. Due to technology upgrades, DSNAP applications must be completed again each year and should be completed annually to ensure household information is up to date. As a CNP operator, a particular benefit is that DSNAP goes towards the Identified Student Percentage, or ISP, for CEP eligibility. This may enhance CEP eligibility by site, system-wide, or may increase the level of free reimbursement for qualifying CEP sites in your SFA. In order to help minimize disruptions to families in the aftermath of a hurricane, CNP operators should provide information in the form of website links and printed information to families. Resources are linked on this page for families and also for program operators that require assistance during a disaster. The FNS Disaster Assistant link on this slide provides disaster resources for individuals, families, and for state and local operators. USDA's Food and Nutrition Services also published the flyer linked on this slide titled Child Nutrition Programs During Disaster. This guide provides information about how children may access healthy meals in the event of a disaster, discusses the type of meal sites that are available during emergencies, provides information about shelters, and offers safety tips. Given what has occurred over the past years, CNP operators may feel that they are ready for any emergency meal services. However, keep in mind that the unique threats of a hurricane season may bring to your school system. Some examples include that hurricanes may bring disruptions in the form of electrical or gas outages, water outages or boil notices, wind and flood damage to buildings, food and supply loss, and added disruptions to deliveries of critical supplies and food and beverage deliveries. Determining modes of communication, both internally and externally, in the form of public outreach and notices, need to be developed and coordinated with risk and emergency management administrators within your district. Now is the time to develop a system for communications that is reliable and accessible both internally and throughout your school community. Training and outreach efforts to inform the public of how to access emergency information should start now. Let's talk about before a hurricane strikes. As a child nutrition program operator, developing a hurricane preparedness guide for CNP managers and staff is essential. This guide should be provided in print for staff to take home and use during a hurricane threat or emergency. CNP operators should stay informed about district policies and stay involved as a member of risk management and emergency preparedness teams. This will ensure the needs of the food service operation are included in the planning for safe shelter should a weather disaster arise unexpectedly, ensure safe reentry after a hurricane event, and will provide ready access to information on resuming services after a hurricane. USDA, in cooperative agreement with the Institute of Child Nutrition, developed the following manuals for hurricane preparedness and emergency readiness planning, including a guide for the school food service operation and forms manual. It is important to print and develop this step-by-step plan and include this guide in the district level planning for a seamless response to a hurricane or disaster. The manuals are linked in this slide and should be printed for developing a plan based on the unique needs of your district and CNP operations. Including LEA level risk management and emergency preparedness team plans and policies is essential for a unified response to meet the needs of the CNP operations during a hurricane or related disasters. For assistance in developing a hurricane plan for your district's child nutrition program, contact the Parish Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness. Local contact numbers are included in the link on the slide. Also contact the state agency for assistance with program questions and procedures related to hurricane or disaster planning. In order to provide a visual, the links on the prior slide will bring you to the guide and the forms for hurricane and other emergency readiness. These are the manuals you will need to complete the detailed process and procedures required for a hurricane plan. When assessing the emergency plan guide in the prior slide, you will see that the top priority is developing a chain of command with specific duties outlined. Essential members of the response team included in the chain of command is included in the forms guide. Identifying essential staff early is essential to the planning process. C&P operators have communicated that after identifying essential staff, that training and clear delegation of duties is of the utmost importance in ensuring preparation and a coordinated response during and after a hurricane. It is also important to emphasize that during a hurricane, a command center or centralized location for communication and for workers to report for instructions is essential. Choose a location for a command center within your district that is outside of a flood zone or tends to be on higher ground, ideally has a generator backup available for electricity, and has a sound structure. Electricity, computers, and regular telephone services will likely be unavailable throughout the district. Therefore, alternative methods of communication should be planned, including battery-powered two-way radios, pagers, and backup chargers available for cell phones. In terms of next steps for hurricane readiness and planning, step 2 is to identify disruptions that may challenge the ability of staff to provide meal services and the importance of determining safe alternatives. Step 3 is to determine a well-designed emergency readiness plan. Step 4 is to train child nutrition program staff on the hurricane readiness plan and procedures. Step 5 is to practice emergency readiness drills. And step 6 is to reassess the emergency plan and effectiveness and update or make changes where needed. Periodic reassessment and updates to emergency plans must be regularly scheduled in order to be effective. C&P operators who have successfully worked through devastating hurricanes have found that adapting to unexpected events and barriers is key to recovery and safe meal service. This requires cross-training staff for production and service duties, as well as clearly explaining expectations for flexibility in positions. Communicating the possibility that staff may have to report to alternate work sites should take place well in advance of a hurricane. An emergency plan is key to a coordinated response. In addition, identifying and establishing emergency resources and contacts is essential prior to a hurricane to ensure various threats and disruptions to services can be handled when they arise. The forms section of the guide provided will assist you in developing a directory and guidebook for your C&P team. This slide shows the 10 steps to developing your guidebook. The forms guide provides these elements in a comprehensive manual for a one-stop resource to share with risk and emergency management teams, leadership, and essential staff. We will discuss the elements of the forms in upcoming slides. To reduce possible confusion, identify the chain of command early in the development stage. Provide a copy of the chain of command to school administrators and school food service personnel. Identify the emergency response team coordinators or coordinator or other school officials who will determine when to activate the plan. Include a calling system or phone tree to ensure a method for contacting everyone in the early stages of a hurricane threat. Also, post the chain of command in a common common location at each food service operation so it is accessible to everyone. It will be crucial to designate specific responsibilities for each of the emergency response team coordinators to ensure that the team is trained and those tasks are assigned. The when, where, and how of emergency response is critical in training food service staff to respond to an emergency. It is also important to prepare staff for rotation of duties and to emphasize flexibility in assignments and the need to report to alternative work sites based on hurricane damage to buildings or for sites that are centralized for high volume services. Remember to verify and update the information in these forms prior to the hurricane season and periodically after. Also, communicate with workers to ensure that you understand who may need to evacuate immediately upon hurricane threat due to family or other circumstances and who will be more likely to be available to work when disaster strikes. Included in the form sections of the guide is a delegation of task list. This list outlines routine tasks and assignments in the food service operation. This list is useful during a time of food service disruption to allow reassignment of tasks to other trained individuals if usual staff is unavailable in the aftermath of a hurricane. After the task of developing the chain of command, emergency response team coordinators will need to be identified with contact information documented. If your food service operation does not have access to pagers or two-way radios, now is the time to organize assignment of district resources to purchase this necessary communication equipment. It is critical to identify the individuals who are responsible for and assigned to the radio communications and to have the list posted in a common location. To ensure security and access during an emergency, identify the individuals who will have keys to the food service facilities. This list also must be readily accessible in print or posted in a common area. Identify school district contacts who will assist the food service operation in case of an emergency. Some examples may be principals, teachers, custodians, nurses, PTO, and other community members. Next, you will identify local and state contacts, including local public health and state agency emergency contacts who will assist in the program challenges that may arise and to identify those who will assist in food service operations. Some examples include public health officials, local sanitarians, Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness parish contacts, the Red Cross, FEMA, and the Division of Nutrition Support state agency contacts. Online links to these agencies and public health officials are included on this slide. Utility companies and community relief organizations should be contacted during the planning stages to determine access to resources if essential food service operations are disrupted. A list of local companies or individuals that may be able to assist in transporting food and supplies for the food service operation or warehousing refrigerated or frozen foods should be listed with a readily accessible contact information on hand. Discussing and arranging emergency operations for this type of assistance in advance is necessary to ensure that CDL licensed drivers are available to drive trucks and available workers are trained in transporting foods safely when needed. Message carriers may be required for timely communications for food service operations when computers, telephones, and other modes of communication are inoperable. Message carriers can deliver essential information to a command center or central location and assist with providing two-way radios or pages to assigned individuals. In addition to the form guides, identify local food sources that are available to replenish necessary foods in an emergency. It is important at this stage to identify your vendor's policies on deliveries prior to and during emergency situations and to determine the actions staff will take to ensure emergency supplies and foods are available. A par level inventory should be developed based on hurricane menus, planned for staff fulfilled, and the supplies that are necessary to provide meals that may be served by alternate methods. The next section of the forms manual is where standard operating procedures are documented as a plan for the safe provision of meals services when electricity, gas, or water service is disrupted. Safety guides addressing these outages will be provided later in this presentation. It is critical in the planning stage to develop a 3-day menu that meets component requirements and that includes shelf-stable items that may be served if the electricity is out or gas or water disruption, allows for minimal cooking capabilities. Remember to include serving sizes based on the yield of these items to ensure menus are planned as reimbursable. The Community Relief Organization section provides an assessment tool for necessary relief that is needed and provides for advanced planning in who to contact for various needs that may arise. As a note on community relief organizations, it is important to be knowledgeable about your district's plan for recovery after a hurricane. For example, will a contract agency be used for building, repair, cleaning, and sanitation should a hurricane devastate your school buildings and kitchens, or will the district plan to provide internal teams for recovery activities? Here are some hurricane and disaster menu planning and inventory tips. In terms of menu planning, hurricane menu items should primarily be shelf-stable, including shelf-stable options for milk to meet C&P meal pattern requirements. Menus must include specific menu items and creditable portion sizes to show that reimbursable meal requirements will be met. These menu items may be used as a part of annual rotating menus to minimize warehousing and inventory burden. Emergency menus should be planned as part of the operational costs to be expended on an annual basis. Keep in mind that these items may be utilized in times of other unexpected disasters like winter storms we've experienced over the years. In the instance that there are no unexpected interruptions to the plan menu, rotate emergency menu items into after-school programs to ensure shelf life and first in, first out. Disaster menu items may also be perceived by students as novel and desirable and may be used to boost participation during statewide testing. Certain emergency menu items that meet Smart Snack guidelines may be used as part of the a la carte sales to boost income to the C&P account. Items determined creditable may also be used to serve for field trip meals later in the school year after hurricane season. Rotating use in this way will prevent spoilage and the burden of warehousing. Emergency foods not utilized during the school year may be used as part of the summer food service program as well. A best practice to attempt to salvage inventory under threat of a hurricane is to centralize storage of frozen and other foods in a location that is least likely to flood and is structurally sound. A location where generator backup is available for electrical outages is ideal, but that is largely dependent on the resources of your district. As you work through completion of your hurricane emergency plan and forms, remember that periodic testing of emergency equipment, especially prior to a hurricane season, is important. In the event of generator failure, or if no generator backup power is available, it is important to research possibilities for safe food storage. For example, you may identify a company that will serve as a transport and for cold food storage for foods and keep a list of the organizations like food banks that may be able to take food donations to avoid complete loss of inventory that will otherwise expire. Understand donation guidelines and regulations for both purchased and USDA foods prior to donating food and ensure that required documentation like inventory records are completed prior to donation. In preparation of a scenario where there is complete or partial loss of inventory, contact your business manager for information related to insurance coverage and the procedures and documentation required for filing an insurance claim. In order to ensure that meals served during an emergency may be claimed for reimbursement, there are steps that should be followed. In certain instances, you may have to decide to serve a safe, nutritious meal that best meets component requirements and then contact the state agency as soon as the immediacy of the emergency at hand is past. The state agency works to accommodate these emergency situations but cannot guarantee a decision on claiming those meals until the scenario is discussed with USDA. A to-do list for state agency approval includes keeping a list of state agency contacts and making initial contact with a state agency staff member as soon as a serious hurricane threat or event is identified. Determining programs available for emergency meal services. Determining waivers or flexibilities needed to provide the meal service type plan based on resources available. Request waivers of flexibilities or approval of a meal service plan based on the current assessment of the weather emergency. Be prepared to provide the state agency with a menu plan based on the meal type with portion sizes included to illustrate how meal components will be met. Plan an accurate point of service and meal plan prepared based on the possibility of no electricity, access to computerized point of service systems, and/or delivery issues identified when contacting vendors. Ensure staff training is completed prior to initiating meal services, especially in terms of staff safety, food safety, sanitation, and accountability measures for documenting emergency meal service. Also, clarify with state agency staff what notes must be included in the C&P online application to ensure approval of the meal service by type and distribution method and any waivers that must be submitted. During emergency situations, you may not have access to the online application, but you should plan to update the online information as soon as services return. In order to create and communicate procedures for hurricanes, tailor a checklist like this one to your district for use by C&P managers during a hurricane threat. Managers at each site will be essential in executing the duties necessary to secure the plan you prepared for a hurricane. Explain where and when to report to work, and if delays should be expected in servicing students. Louisiana 511 is a valuable resource to provide to staff with updates about weather-related road conditions, road closures, and live video feeds from traffic cameras. Encourage staff to check on a safe route before leaving their homes. Remember to request updated contact information or complete what is often called a calling tree to enhance notifications regarding a hurricane threat. Cell phone numbers, home numbers, and other means of contact should be obtained for all C&P staff. Managers should provide a good contact number for work-related questions. C&P directors and managers should provide contact information to principals. Distribute hard copies of essential phone numbers, menus, including the current month's menus, as well as an emergency menu. Ensure each manager prints a current inventory list of food and supplies to take home and keep as a second copy secured at the central office. Print student rosters and secure a copy in a high file cabinet at the central office and each school site. Establish contact with vendors regarding emergency supplies or foods needed for the emergency and discuss emergency distribution plans. Place food, supply, and milk orders before leaving school. Milk orders should be placed as though no milk is on hand, like an example, a 10-day supply of milk. Request vendor information about what the food and supply distribution plan is for weather emergencies and request projected delivery plans. Ensure supplies are ordered for delivery as though no items are on hand and to cover a period of time, for example, 10 days. The next part of the sample checklist for C&P managers is the facility to-do list. The facility portion includes outside the building, secure all loose items or store them indoors, close and lock all windows and doors, store all items off of the floor in case of a flood, freeze any refrigerated items as appropriate, discard leftovers and other items that will expire within a few days. For refrigerators and freezers, leave space around vents and fans. Do not store anything on top of reach-in refrigerator or freezer units. Shut doors well before leaving for the day. Move all frozen foods to a central or walk-in freezer. Shut doors before leaving for the day. Move all milk out of the milk boxes and clean boxes well, and keep boxes plugged in with the door shut. The last part of the checklist includes what must be done at each facility right before leaving for the day when a hurricane threat. For example, unplugging certain smallwares and computers and storing them in a safe place will be important to ensure working systems when returning to the building. Recording temperatures should occur regularly during the day and right before leaving to ensure that food recovery is handled in a safe way with time and temperature control in mind when returning to the building. In terms of delivery trucks, assigned drivers should fill up the fuel tanks with gas before leaving for the day and report to the transportation department to ensure trucks are parked in a secure and safe location with keys stored appropriately for access by the emergency response team. Now that we have covered planning and procedures before a hurricane, let's move on to discuss preparation for a coordinated response after a hurricane strikes. After a hurricane strikes, follow LDH guidelines for safety and resuming operations. When planning to return after a hurricane, contact the local health department for approval to reopen or operate if a sufficient quantity of potable water is not provided to all fixtures that require water, electrical power has been lost for 4 or more hours, if flood waters have entered the food service operation, when the sewer system is not properly functioning, or if a fire in the facility has occurred and when water pressure has been lost or a boil water notice is in effect. When discussing important considerations for hurricane preparedness with the Louisiana Department of Health, the following considerations were emphasized. C&P operators must ensure potable water is available before attempting to open food service operations or prepare food. When completing the emergency readiness plan forms in the guide provided, be sure to pre-plan utility contacts and plan in advance with vendors to secure water tanks and bottled water to ensure that is sufficient water for cooking and water consumption by students and staff. A general guide for planning the amount of water needed to resume services is that 1 gallon of water per individual per day, plus what is needed for cooking, must be available. Be certain to follow LDH and/or utility instructions on boil advisories by boiling water using instructions provided by LDH prior to the use in cooking. LDH provides emergency guides under the link on this slide titled In Case of Disaster. Print these guides and ensure safe operations after a hurricane. Fact sheets included in this link include, in case of disaster, food service operating after an emergency, boil advisory guidelines for food service operations, boil water advisories and recommendations, what to do after a flood, food safety after a fire, FDA emergency information, FDA emergency resources, guidelines for food service facilities operating under a boil advisory, in case of a power outage, food safety for power outages, food safety for power outages information video. An additional guide to keep on hand is how to apply food safety during alternative meal service. This guide was prepared for the purposes of the pandemic, but also applies to alternative services that may result from a hurricane. Food safety during a power outage is a concern whether the electricity goes out for hours or days. Best practices for hurricane threats include consolidating frozen and/or refrigerated foods to a central location with a generated backup, use of a rented mobile refrigerator, freezers, or trucks. An important consideration before a hurricane is to ensure that employees will be available that are licensed to drive a truck and that vehicles are gassed up and located in an area least likely to be susceptible to flood waters. Remember that if you're planning to store foods in frozen or refrigerated trucks, a sufficient amount of fuel must be available to keep the trucks running and temperatures controlled. Foodsafety.gov provides charts on refrigerated foods and power outages, when to save it and when to throw it out, and a link is provided on this slide. Power outages may be for as little as a few hours or could extend for days. This guide explains food handling according to the amount of time power has been out. As the USDA states in the link, keep your foods safe during emergencies, power outages, floods, and fires. Refrigerators will keep food safe for up to 4 hours during a power outage. Keep the door closed as much as possible. Discard refrigerated perishable foods such as meat, poultry, fish, eggs, and leftovers after 4 hours without power. You will have to evaluate each item separately, and the chart provided is meant to be a general guide. A full freezer will hold safe temperatures for approximately 48 hours or 24 hours if it's half full and the door remains closed. Remember to never taste food to determine its safety. Use the refrigerated and frozen foods chart as a general guide, and when in doubt, throw it out. Floodwaters can damage many foods in a school nutrition operation, but some foods may be salvaged. School nutrition employees need to know what foods can be safely salvaged and how to salvage those foods. Using proper salvaging methods will save money while maintaining the safety of the food available to serve. C&P operators and managers must check all food for exposure to flood waters, discarding food that may have been damaged, and cleaning and sanitizing packages of food that can be salvaged. If a school has been required to close its kitchen due to a flood, it should not reopen until it has been authorized to do so by a local or state regulatory authority. Refer to the Institute of Child Nutrition's guide titled Salvaging Food After a Flood to ensure safe recovery of food, and remember, when in doubt, throw it out. During hurricanes and other weather events that disrupt electricity or deliveries, milk is the first menu component that is of concern. In terms of regular operation, 2 types of fluid milk must be offered, one being unflavored milk. Fat content must be fat-free or low-fat. Flavored milk must be fat-free, while unflavored milk may be fat-free or 1%. Pasteurized fluid milk with levels of vitamin A and D specified are required. In the instance of an emergency such as a hurricane where conditions temporarily prevent a school that normally has supply of fluid milk from obtaining delivery of such milk, the state agency may allow the school to serve meals during the emergency period with an alternate form of fluid milk or without fluid milk. Approval by the state agency occurs on a case-by-case basis, and the SFA must submit adequate justification in order for the meals served to be considered reimbursable. It is recommended that SFAs purchase a certain amount of shelf-stable fluid milk or dry milk in order to meet short-term needs consisting of a 3-day supply. This regulation should only be used in a short-term emergency with efforts in place to resume regular milk delivery and services as soon as possible. Typically, a waiver submission and justification of delivery failures with documentation provided by the vendor is required for approval. A nutrition support memo will be issued if the Office of the Governor issues a proclamation to allow emergency procurement of goods and services as a result of a hurricane or other weather emergency. Stay aware of expiration and/or extension dates, and note that documentation of emergency procurement procedures is required during the emergency proclamation period. Procurement by non-competitive proposal under 2 CFR 2.320 are allowed when the public emergency does not permit a delay resulting from competitive solicitation. In terms of allowable costs under an emergency proclamation, costs applied under an emergency proclamation must fall within the regulations outlined in 2 CFR 200.403. Factors affecting allowability of costs, including but not limited to, that the expenditures to the CMP must be necessary, reasonable, and allocable for the performance of the federal award. Also note that costs must be adequately documented for audit purposes. Under 2 CFR 200, Emergency Procurement Regulations, if it is necessary to make an emergency procurement to continue service, the purchase shall be made and a log of all such purchases shall be maintained by a representative of the SFA. The following emergency procedures shall be followed. All emergency procurements shall be approved by an SFA official knowledgeable of CMP regulations and someone who has signed the procurement certification for the Code of Conduct. Emergency procurement procedures that must be documented include the item name, dollar amount, vendor or contractor, and reason for emergency. Regulations and resources to guide you through meal programs during a disaster response are included on this page. It includes Memo SFSP 03-2020 Meal Service during unanticipated school closures, Memo SFSP 18-2014 Disaster Response, providing CMP benefits to disaster survivor evacuees, the Eligibility Manual for School Meals, USDA's FNS Disaster Assistant Information, and Memo SFS 23-101 Summer 2023 Non-Congregate Meal Service in Rural Areas, Q&A number 2, and refer to question number 8 about unanticipated school closures. The information provided on this slide covers frequent issues reported by SFAs during previous hurricanes. I don't plan to read the list, but provided it is resources for your review to ensure that you're prepared these interruption services that commonly occur during hurricane season. USDA Foods for Disaster Response will be discussed as the final topic for this presentation. Program resources, regulations, and procedures must be considered when handling and requesting USDA food assistance during a disaster such as a hurricane. USDA provides tiered access to funding based on the level of disaster. USDA foods may be issued to provide relief when resources are sufficient during the situation of distress, presidential emergency declaration, or presidential declared major disaster. There are different disaster types and allowances for USDA foods depending on the type. In all instances, sponsor must notify the food distribution program of the type of situation and the foods needed, and the distributing agency will stay in contact with USDA as necessary. The USDA Foods Disaster Manual is linked on this slide as a reference for planning. Please print this guide and add it to your hurricane plan. The state distribution agency's role in a hurricane or disaster is to communicate with SFAs when foods may be used for congregant feeding and to allow SFAs to utilize USDA foods in situations of distress. Additionally, the state distribution agency provides FNS with source documents from SFAs of inventory used during the emergency. In a presidentially declared disaster or emergency, USDA foods can be used for congregant feeding and are guaranteed to be replaced and do not need further USDA headquarters approval. The state distribution agency has the authority to release USDA food for congregant feeding sites upon SFA request. As introduced earlier in the training, a situation of distress is a natural, catastrophic, or other event that does not meet the definition of disaster. Examples could include a hurricane, fire, flood, or snowstorm. A situation of distress is described as a natural catastrophic event or other situation that has not been declared a disaster or emergency by the President, but in the judgment of the State Distributing Agency or FNS, it warrants the use of USDA foods. In a situation of distress, no presidential declaration is required. The distributing agency works to replace USDA foods through food nutrition services to the extent funds are available. The state distribution agency can release USDA funds for congregate feeding sites only if there is a natural event and it is limited to 30 days. If the event is not deemed a natural event, the state distributing agency must obtain FNS approval before releasing the USDA foods. In terms of record keeping, the following documentation must be completed by the SFA. The material code and description of USDA foods used, the quantity or cases of the USDA foods used, the number of individuals served at congregate feeding sites, the date USDA foods were issued to a congregate feeding site, and the name of the organization receiving the inventory. Attachment 10 of the Louisiana NSLP handbook should be used as a template for documentation purposes. Two forms that may be required for USDA foods reporting in a hurricane event are attachments 9 and 10 of the NSLP handbook. On the left-hand slide is attachment 9, used for documenting redonation of USDA foods. This form should be completed at the time of redonation of a commodity item to another eligible recipient agency. Prior approval for a redonation must be given by the Food Distribution Field Supervisor or Food Distribution Division, as some categories of recipient agencies are not eligible for certain commodity items. The inventory of the recipient agency must also be considered. Copies of the redonation statement should be retained by both the donating and receiving agencies, and the original should be sent to the Louisiana Department of Agriculture and Forestry Food Distribution Division. The disaster feeding reporting form on the right, attachment 10, was referenced in the last slide and is included as part of the Louisiana NSLP handbook. This form is used to document emergency feeding and must be returned to the State Distribution Agency office within 72 hours of emergency feeding with applicable attachments. The Louisiana State Distribution Agency contact information for emergency situations is provided on this slide. Please note that the main contacts are listed first, as they are the ones at the LDAF Emergency Operations Centers the entire time. But prior to the hurricane, if possible, the SFAs should reach out to their program manager. Please utilize the contact list for questions regarding USDA foods during a hurricane or other emergency. Thank you for your time and attention today for the hurricane preparedness training. If you have any questions, please contact Louisiana Division of Nutrition Support at 225-342-9661 or by emailing us at childnutritionprograms@la.gov. If you have any current questions, you can send them in the chat box and I will see if we have any, and I'll be right back. At this time, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box, but if you do have questions, like I said, you can give us a call or you can email us at childnutritionprograms@la.gov, and we'll be happy to help answer any questions you may have. So without anything else, oh, we have one chat coming in. Let's see. Oh, thank you. Okay. If that's all for today. Everyone have a good afternoon and see y'all for the next training.